Hi, I'm Seamless, and this is the first video in my three-part series contribution to the Learn with Splice series about music production that they're putting up on their whole thing. It's a lot of fun, a lot of cool. My particular series is going to be about the basic forms of audio synthesis. We'll cover subtractive synthesis, which is this video, FM synthesis, and additive synthesis. You can follow along with this video by looking at the project file in the Splice DNA player, which will just show you the project file. You can also download it, open it for yourself, and poke around with things. I haven't actually made it yet, so you're looking at the future now when you're watching this video. This whole video is going to be basically about explaining what the individual types of synthesis are, doing some demonstrations with that kind of synthesis for particular sound design, and then there'll be examples in the project file that I have already made. I don't know what those are yet, but you do, because you're in the future. Anyway, let's start off. Hair floating around because I have a lot of hair. Anyway, subtractive synthesis, based on its name, can be thought of as the idea that you're starting with something complex and you're taking away from it. The most basic expression of this is when we have a basic complex. Yeah, that makes sense. A complex waveform, such as something harmonically rich like a saw wave, and then we put on it a filter of some kind. The ever-important low-pass filter is a pretty basic and obvious example. So this is the idea that we're starting with a whole bunch of harmonics and then we're taking away from them to create a new sound. For a lot of people who are producers, they're not really thinking about this as something that is actually creating a new sound. You're just thinking about the idea that you're modulating a sound. And that modulation is still a new sound. And this is important to consider this fact because a lot of the more advanced ideas of subtractive synthesis will hinge on the idea that we are still working with mostly the same pieces of something, but we are using it in such a way to get much more interesting results. Filtering is just the first and most obvious kind of subtractive synthesis. Throughout, especially the etymology, history, lineage, I suppose, of modern electronic dance music. The filter, especially the low pass and also the bandpass, are among the more important. They're the ones that create the most basic kind of bass wobbles and those things that were very popular in the earliest of dubstep, and also created a lot of like the old school drum and bass sound design and that kind of idea. And it's pretty much all based on the idea of filters. So I'm going to call this guy low pass demo. I'm also going to color it because why not? I don't know, weird pink purple stuff. That's fine. You might notice I'm using an equalizer to do this, and you might be thinking, well, it's not really a filter. And I mean, a lot of you probably were like, well, of course it's a filter. And that's because equalizers use the basic ideas of how filters exist to do their job. Other filters that are just filters are designed to have the filter workflow with things like cutoff frequency and resonant frequency and Q value, which is resonant frequency. It's still the same concept. This is the filter type, and the cutoff frequency is being determined by this knob down here, which is the thing that I'm automating over here. And there we have a pretty reasonable demonstration of what could have passed for a relatively okay dubstep track back, maybe 11 years ago. Another example of a pretty basic filter idea is the same idea, only instead of a low pass filter, you could use a band pass filter. The four basic types of filters that there are what we just saw, which is low pass. Of course, I was using the steeper version of it, but the idea of a resonant frequency is usually tied to the Q value. In this case, the Q value is this guy, which makes it at the point of the cutoff more ringy. In case you ever wanted to, attenuate certain ideas. And then the bandpass filter, the Q value is what it refers to as bandwidth. Of course, they all actually are called bandwidth, but if you're unfamiliar with your own, if you're just brand new to sound design, that sound should have been extremely familiar to you because it is very much a common kind of modulation to do to a sound. So now let's make another pattern. Call this one Bandpass Demo. Let's color it blue. Just like the same first one, moving it around, we'll make it very clear. Something that's interesting about the bandpass filter is that it doesn't necessarily sound good going entirely all the way up like the low pass does. I personally enjoy keeping it low, which of course you can change yourself. I mean, this is all up to you. Obviously, you are the engineer, you are the designer. All kinds of fun. The other filter types are high pass and notch, otherwise known as band stop. If I were going to do back to this guy, I'll just demonstrate those. I'm not going to make demos for them. They're pretty self-explanatory. High pass filter is the opposite of a low pass filter. Instead of cutting off high and going down, this one cuts off down and goes high. That probably sounded a lot like, just a little bit like what the bandpass sounds like. And actually, as it turns out, if you have a low pass filter and a high pass filter, if you modulate both of them together, you can kind of approximate what a bandpass does and its behavior. Because you are, in fact, just passing a band. And then there's the band stop, or otherwise known as a notch. Which is basically the opposite of a bandpass filter, where it completely mutes a section of frequencies as opposed to only allowing through a particular section of frequencies. So that may sound just a little bit familiar to you as well. A lot of these are like the basic building blocks of pretty much all sound design. As complicated as the sounds get, and especially when we're using other synthesis types like FM or additive, subtractive synthesis is involved in all of them, no matter what. And not just because of the filters. The filtering is the most obvious kind of subtractive synthesis, but the kind that actually does matter just a little bit more in terms of basic importance is actually phase cancellation, which isn't really it's not really talked about as much in terms of being a subtractive concept. In fact, it might technically be an additive concept, but I really think of it as a subtractive concept because it does still take away from the original sound. I mentioned the old school drum and bass sound design before, and one of the more basic things that you can do with drum and bass sound is to have a saw wave, have another saw wave, and then detune them against each other, which is to say that one of them is no longer the same pitch as the other. And you get that. That particular behavior is referred to as a Reese bass. A Reese bass. Reese bass. Not Reese bass. Reese bass. So it's like trying to say it's not while saying snot. Anyway, what's happening here is that because the two waveforms are slightly off pitch, it's causing rhythmic phase cancellation, where it gets out of phase, gets back into phase over and over again, which is why, because it's pitch based, when I play lower notes, the rhythmic oscillation is not as fast as when I play higher notes. In the waveform world, pitch is equivalent to speed. How fast the waveform is oscillating will determine how high or low the pitch is. Faster oscillations is higher pitch. Slower oscillations is lower pitch. So this means that if you have something that's dependent upon the difference in the two pitches, faster notes will have that difference will be articulated faster than over a lower pitch. But let's look at this actually, like for real. And we're going to do this with sine waves. Before I do that, though, I'm going to give you a sort of a visual demonstration of phase cancellation. Let's do a parameter that doesn't matter. Just some some volume filter somewhere. Now, this isn't an actual waveform, although in the analog world, this actually would be literally the same thing as a waveform. But what I'm doing right now is I'm going to create something that's very just visual, so we can look at it and kind of understand. So here we've got ourselves a sine wave. What I said about the analog world is basically true, because in the analog world, the difference between what we see as an LFO and an audio rate oscillation is literally the same thing. It's just where it gets directed. If you direct a signal like this into a speaker cone or an amplifier into a speaker cone, then it'll move the thing, move air, and we get, sound. But then if you direct a signal to, say, a parameter, then it starts to move the parameter around. This is how analog synths operate. And so it actually means that a signal like this and a signal that produces a tone, there is really no difference between them. The only real difference that matters is where it's being pointed. This doesn't really matter for us when we're doing what we're doing here. But that's actually why an LFO is referred to as a low frequency oscillation, because it's an oscillation that's so slow that you're not really able to determine it as a pitch, even though technically it is a pitch. And then there's the opposite side of that, the audio rate oscillation, where it's a pitch that's so high that it's so fast that you can only determine it as a tone. You don't discern individual oscillations. Of course, you could have an LFO that is about base tone level, and that's where things like filter FM come into play, where we're actually we're oscillating a parameter at audio rate. That's not something that digital applications can do very well. Some of them can do a kind of hacky version of it. That's something that's still very much the purview of the analog world. However, the reason why I'm doing this is because I want to demonstrate what I mean by phase cancellation. So, first of all, let's define phase. Phase, as we can think of it here, is sort of the starting position of a waveform. Because if you look at this little cut right here, this is a one entire period of a waveform. It's not going anywhere. It's not moving. This is one whole oscillation. This is the repetition that, when repeated fast enough, creates the tone. Now, phase is what I just did there when I moved it. This is us moving phase. That's really all that is this. Now it's moving phase and that kind of thing. But when we start talking about phase cancellation, is when we start adding waveforms together. You can add a waveform together just like you would most things, because a waveform is measured in positive amplitude and negative amplitude. Here's the tip of the toppest part of the oscillation is the positive, and then the bottom is negative. The center line is 0, where there is no value. And you add these together, so this is 1 plus 1 and then minus 1, and this is plus 1 and minus 1. You put them together, you get plus 2 and minus 2, and you just get a louder waveform. But if you were to add these together like this is saying you're adding a positive and a negative, and it will cancel out. In fact, if you have 100% out of phase sounds coming together like so, it will be inaudible. You won't hear anything. And I can actually demonstrate this with real world examples.
All right.
With this guy.
All right.
I'm going to make a copy of it, and I'm going to reverse the polarity, which turns the negatives into positives and the positives into negatives. It's essentially putting it 100% out of phase. Total nothingness. This particular phenomenon only works, however, when the waveforms are 100% opposite. If I were to move this even a little bit,
all right,
it sounds a little weird. It sounds phasey, in fact, but you can still hear it because the oscillation difference is not enough for it to be perfectly negative. Now, these two waveforms together they're identical at the moment. They're the same pitch and the same speed. If I were to, however, make one of these a different speed, like this, for example, what we start to see when we add them together is that even if they start perfectly in phase, as in they both start at the exact same moment and they both start at 0, because one of them is a different pitch, does a different speed, they get out of phase. So much so that every so often they get completely out of phase. And then they get back into phase. So this right here is an example of what that saw wave was doing when we were making the respace, where it got out of phase and then it got back into phase over and over again. And then how fast this happened was determined by the base pitch of each of these things. This idea is also referred to as unison, where, I mean, in the music theory world, unison is essentially just saying what happens when you make a chord that is just 2 notes. This is usually reserved for when you have 2 voices, which is to say one instrument and then another instrument. If they're playing the exact same note, it is a unison. You might have seen that term actually being applied into synths. Let's find that respace here. On Citrus, for example, on the front page, we have this unison section. And what this does is it allows us to create a number of voice copies. like we did manually when we made two different saw voices. However, this just does it as an automatic process. And here, these different parameters give us the same basic control that we have over it. We have how loud the unison is, pitch difference, which is just detuning the two against each other. This adds in subharmonics, so we're not going to deal with that. And then the phase. So basically what this is doing is that this is saying that we can make the waveforms begin out of phase as opposed to starting in phase. This is particularly important, especially when we use higher number of voices. That like beefy beginning there, that plucky kind of sound, is the result of starting everything in phase. But if you start everything out of phase, it starts to get smoother. So that's how you control that, if that's something you wanted to do. This sound, however, that we're doing right now is referred to as a supersaw. This supersaw is built on the idea of phase cancellation. In fact, if we look at the harmonic activity here, all that mess we're seeing in the harmonic spectrum is extremely high frequency phase cancellation. Because while we're doing the example of the phase cancellation with the saw wave there, or the sine wave, a saw wave has a lot of harmonic activity, which means to say it's basically like saying it has a whole bunch of additional sine waves going higher and higher in the spectrum that if any of them get out of phase, then they're all going to phase cancel as well. Because they're harmonic, which is to say that the extra partials, which is referred to as partials, that are on top of the original fundamental, which is the lowest tone, are multiples of the fundamental, and that makes them harmonic, and that's why they're referred to as harmonic partials. We'll get more into that when we talk about additive synthesis. But the idea being is that, remember what we said about how the phase cancellation, how fast it happens, is based on the base pitch. So when these extremely high frequency sounds, like these individual harmonics, are being phased against a slightly detuned version of itself, it's going to phase cancel a lot faster than the fundamental is. And if all these different harmonics have a different rate at which they oscillate, and when you have 9 voices colliding against each other, it creates this kind of cloudy wash of a sound, which gives us supersaws. And that was some compression going on there. But this is why a supersaw is an extremely big part of pretty much all, saw waves in general. And the reason why saw waves are important is because saw waves have a lot of harmonic content. Because remember, subtractive synthesis is all about starting with something complex and then taking away from it. And the saw wave has just a lot of the harmonic activity that people want in some things. The extra width that we get using a supersaw actually gives us a lot of leeway in terms of some particularly special things that we can do. And if you're a fan of trance at all, you should know where this is going. So let's talk about Plucks. Now, we have made a supersaw, and I'm going to put it through a filter. I'm going to use Citrus. I'm using Citrus to do this, but what I'm doing right now is like one of the more basic things you can do with subtractive synthesis. This is like one step above the difficulty is presented by the dubstep wobble that I showed up there. We're going to make a supersaw pluck. So I put it in the filter, and the filter is a cutoff. It's a low pass filter, which is what I want. And I'm going to attach an envelope to the filter. The envelope is just a controller that we're setting to make it do things. You can kind of see it doing here. An envelope is broken up into attack, decay, sustain, and release by default. We could do a lot more with that just because it's that envelope. We can do just kind of do whatever we want. But the basic idea is attack, decay, sustain, release. Attack is given to the idea of how long it takes for it to actualize. The decay is where it goes down to. The sustain is where, when you hold down the note, it stays. And then release is when you let go of the note, how long it takes for it to go away completely. I'm, however, going to get rid of all that. And we're going to make just the simplest of just down like this. Although I am going to actually start it right here. This particular interface with the envelope as it's being applied to the cutoff frequency of the filter is one where the middle line represents where the knob's value currently is. So right now, if I put it in the center, this is basically representing 100%, 0%. Something you need to do in the Citrus when you're doing this kind of thing is that you need to ensure that the end dot is set to be the sustain, so that when I let go of the note, even if the thing hasn't done its thing yet, it'll stop instead of just holding on until it goes to the actual full time of the link. Just so you know. And that basically is what a pluck does. Let's write some chords. What was I doing earlier? I was doing... Sure. That was... I am in the wrong snap. Don't worry about that. And a lot of the lessons that I've done, a lot of the students wanted to learn how to make this particular kind of sound design, and they were all just baffled by how easy this is. Not all of them, a lot of them knew it, but they were looking for sort of the difference, the thing that makes it like why, like how they make it, you know, how they make it, like, you know, is there some kind of secret to the fact that people are using certain other things, and really it's all just based on the same basic idea. The differences are minute.
All
Sure. Of course, the value of some of this, let's actually rename this too. Pluck. Make you green. We're going green. That's an impressive amount of resonance for something that wasn't that resonant to begin with. And then what's that? Why not? Let's get some reverb in here. Reverb, where do you live? You live here. If you ever wondered how to do that, that's how you do that. And every time that you're ever going to hear that, that's how they're doing it. I'm not saying that like it needs to be more complicated than that, or that it needs to be that it's dumb for being so simple. It's just that it is that simple, and it's pretty easy to use as a tool as well. So super saws and the filter plugging is a big part of just a lot. And this is just a basic low pass filter. I used the default. I didn't even change it. I just attached the pluck envelope to it. And just about any plugin that has filters in it will let you do this to it. Just off the top of my head, Silent can do it really well. Massive can do it. FM8 can do it. Just about every plugin inside FL can do it. And if you really want to, you can also automate it yourself. But like we were doing earlier with this guy over here. This is technically a pluck. If we were doing it with a sound like this, it would sound basically the same. This is a pretty good place to stop in terms of subtractive synthesis. We've basically given you all the building blocks for it. We've shown you the value of a saw wave. We've shown you how Unison works and phase cancellation works. We've shown you what filters are for, identify what they are and what they can do. And with that, even without the FM synthesis portion and the additive synthesis portion, that's enough that you could do just about 80% of all electronic sound design. Is based on that concept alone. And it's worth noting that it's one of the concepts that we've been with for the longest time. The older analog sounds and synthesis was pretty much entirely based on this idea. Additive synthesis as a concept has been around for a pretty long time just because the math that it's based on has been around for a while. And FM is also important as well in the analog sense. It's just the kind of FM that we do now and that I'm going to talk about in the FM part is based on very much on how digital FM works. Actual, like I was talking about analog FM and the signal pathing and that kind of thing is not, it still bears some truth, but it's not the same kind of idea. And it's also not nearly as wieldy as the digital variety, which we'll talk about how that works out when we actually get to the next part, which will be just the next video. And that kind of good stuff. This project, as you're looking at it right now, will have been the thing that you downloaded from Splice and could look at and do whatever. And I'm sure this part confused the hell out of you the first time you saw that, but this should have now made sense. I hope that this helped you. If you have any questions about this, let me know. And as usual, have a nice day.